Moon is mind. The journey after death is of the mind and not the soul. The soul is still. The soul is the part of the universal consciousness addressed as God by the human world. Soul is as pure as water. Always remember, the whole journey of birth and death and the sufferings of human life is centered around the mind. That is why the great spiritual master Nisargadatta Maharaj says that suffering is always mental. Pain is physical, suffering is mental. Beyond the mind, there is no suffering. Pain is essential for the survival of the body, but none compels you to suffer. Suffering is due entirely to clinging or resisting. It is a sign of our unwillingness to move on, to flow with life. Beyond the mind, there is no suffering. And so the whole story comes down to that one thing, and that is the mind. The mind is represented by moon in astrology. Ketu is one of the greatest and the most beautiful energy that helps the sadhak, the spiritual seeker, to completely kill the mind. When the mind dies, when the death of the mind happens, enlightenment happens. That is when a Buddha is born. Buddha is not a name. Buddha is the state of no mind. Ketu moon brings the great potential of experiencing the state of no mind. Every great spiritual master has emphasized on killing the mind, the death of the mind. A young spiritual seeker once asked Bhagwan Ramana Maharishi how to kill the mind. Bhagwan smiled and said, "The mind cannot kill the mind. Anything that you endure to do with the mind will only reinforce and perpetuate the notion of mind. Rather than pointlessly wondering, how shall I eradicate the mind, go on seeking the mind. Search for what mind is results in its disappearance." So when you start searching for mind, the mind starts disappearing. That is the beauty. The thing to do is to completely ignore the objects that appear by the reflected light of the mind, and instead seek the source of the mind's illumination. If the source of the mind is continuously sought for, it begins to subside. The point of focus is to continuously hold on to the subject, no matter what the experience might be that present themselves. Pay no attention and continue to remain focused on the subject. The subject is your notion of I. Go on examining this notion until it disappears. The foremost focus of a true spiritual seeker is to ensure that the mind disappears, the mind dies, that the mind goes through the cycle of death. The greatest and the wisest master of all spiritual masters, Gorakhnath, says, "Die, O yogi, die. Die, sweet is dying. Because in this universe there is nothing sweeter than death. Die that death, and die such a death Gorakh died and saw. Die that way in which Gorakh attained enlightenment. In the same way you die and see. One death we are already familiar with, in which the body dies, but our ego and mind go on living. This same ego finds a new womb. This same ego, troubled by new desires, again starts off on the journey. Even before leaving behind one body, it is already eager for another body. This death is not the real death.